virtual show. Well, I don't know how many people have been to Avik's lectures with us before. This is the third time he's talking to us, all on different subjects. And but again, my name is Erwin Ackerman. I'm a board member of the Kader Institute. Been there since almost the beginning. And we slowly but surely have grown as a group, and more interesting speakers as we go ahead. And Avik is one of those. He's from Austin, Texas. He works out of Washington, D.C. His organization is called, it's a little, I know, it's a president of called the Foundation for Research and Equal Opportunity. Okay? It's not really a political organization, although it deals in politics, because he's dealing with people from both the Republican and Democratic side, dealing with issues that hopefully can bring them together, and that's what he's going to talk about this morning. So here he is, Avik. It's all yours.
Thanks, Erwin. Great to be with you all. I think I have a clicker here. Okay, great. So it's great to be back here in Palm Beach. Thanks to you all for coming. I know it's a little drizzly out there. The description of this session is, how progressives and conservatives can find common ground. And I had some questions about that from some friends who were thinking of coming, and they're like, well, wait a minute, I don't have any common ground with the people I disagree with in politics. I mean, why do I want to find common ground with them? And so I think what I'll try to explain to you today is, like, look, all of us in this room care about the fate of the country. We care about what we think was wrong with the country, and we're often very demoralized by how hard it seems to fix these problems or bring people together to solve these problems. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is how I and a small group of people I work with have found a way to make progress in the other direction. And the key is, as I allude to in this title for my talk, is how economic freedom can expand opportunity for all Americans. So what is the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, or FREOP? It's a think tank that I started with some friends in 2016, which was, as we all know, a very interesting year in American politics. And the basic idea behind FREOP, coming out of a lot of work I had done, I spent a dozen years on Wall Street as a biotech investor, a healthcare investor. Before that, I'd gone to medical school and trained as a scientist, as a molecular biologist. But my first job out of med school was at Bain Capital, trying to understand the then early genomics and biotech industries. And one thing led to another, and I started to get involved in healthcare reform. And the thing I learned about working on healthcare reform is that the healthcare system is so screwed up that you can actually improve the healthcare system in ways that both progressives and conservatives care about. So if you're a progressive or a left of center person, you're really worried about the fact that so many people can't afford their health insurance or go uninsured. Or if you're a conservative who's worried about the cost of healthcare and entitlements and the federal debt. All these things go together, right? Our healthcare system is so messed up that progressives and conservatives can win at the same time. You can have a universal healthcare system that actually is more fiscally sustainable than the system that we have today. And that's not just true of healthcare, that's true of a lot of issues. So that insight from working on healthcare reform is what led me and some others to build an organization that applied that lesson throughout public policy. To say, you know what? It's not necessarily true that the other side, on every issue, that the other side has to lose for my side to win. There are ways to achieve the progressive outcome of a more affordable education, a more affordable healthcare system, more affordable housing, a more affordable everyday life, more opportunity for wage growth and job growth for lower and middle income Americans, but deploy free enterprise and competition and innovation to help deliver those goals. And so our mission is to expand economic opportunity to those who least have it using the tools of economic freedom, individual liberty, technological innovation, and pluralism. And And so everything we work on has to meet two tests. Test number one is everything we work on has to meaningfully improve the lives of Americans on the bottom half of the ladder, and we measure that. And the second thing we say is that everything we work on has to result in a net expansion of individual economic freedom. And again, you might think, well, there's lots of ways to improve the lives of lower income people, and there's lots of ways to improve economic freedom, but putting those two things together is what makes our organization unusual. And the reason why we do it that way is not just because we want to be different, but because if you want to solve some of these really big problems in America and get Republicans and Democrats to work together, this is, I would argue, the only way to do it. You can do it another way, which is to split the difference, right? Just say, we're going to go along to get along, you know, basically let the lobbyists get what they want and move on, right? That's how things work today in Washington. But if you want to solve these big problems, these big challenges that Americans have, what I'm going to argue to you today is we found a formula that is starting to work. So, and I talked about this for those of you who heard me at the reception yesterday. You know, the narrative you hear, if you read the paper, watch cable news, whatever it is that we're hopelessly divided as a country, right? Republicans and Democrats hate each other, red states, blue states, we have these tribes, we're always yelling at each other, we have our own cable news channels, etc. But the interesting thing is, if you actually poll Americans and ask them, what is it you think America should stand for? 80% of them, in poll after poll after poll say, I think America should be a place where everyone is free to pursue their dreams and where everyone has a fair shot at success. Those are the two things that 80% of Americans believe. Now, does that sound like a country that's fundamentally divided on values? No. Actually, if you walk down the street and you talk to anyone, you talk to the person who made you your coffee this morning, you talk to the Uber driver, you talk to, you know, your neighbors, your friends, your teachers, they'll all tell you that that's what they want America to stand for. They want America to be a place where people are free to pursue their dreams and where people, regardless of their humble beginnings or how well they're connected, that we all have a fair shot at getting ahead in this country and making a better life for our kids. Now, we may have different views about how to define fair shot at success and equal opportunity or how to achieve it, but those are empirical questions. Those are questions that evidence and data can be brought to bear on. What is the best way to expand opportunity for those who least have it? We can have a discussion about that where we're starting from the same values and then debating, okay, what's the best way to manifest those values, right? That is not a country that's divided on values. It's a country where actually we're pretty united on what we stand for. Now, there are a lot of people who want to present a different story, and we can get into why. But the good news is, and the fundamental premise of why we call ourselves the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, is that this overwhelming majority of Americans still believes in these values. And again, there's more pessimism or more optimism about whether America is living up to that standard or how to do it, but the values are there. The core element that we can use to bring more people together around better ideas is there. But what's interesting is that the rising generation of Americans is much more pessimistic about whether America is fair to them and fair in general. So one way to think about that from in terms of our economic system is if you ask baby boomers and older, or if you ask my generation, the Gen Xers, do you have positive or negative views of capitalism versus socialism? If you ask boomers, you ask Gen X, about 2/3 say I have positive views of capitalism and 1/3 say I have positive views of socialism. For millennials and Gen Z, it's basically 50-50. Why is that? You know, some people might say, well, it's because of these schools and what they're getting taught in school. That might be part of it, but I would argue that there are observable and real economic forces that are leading them to be pessimistic about how fair our economic system is for them and how much opportunity they feel our economic system is bringing to them, which they associate with capitalism. Here is a chart that's showing you the median household income in Florida, which before the financial crisis was about $61,000 in 2021 dollars and is about $60,000 when COVID started. So basically, it's been flat, right? The median income in Florida on an inflation-adjusted basis is actually slightly down over the last 15 years, right? went down a lot in the financial crisis, started to recover, and then during COVID popped up a little bit because of all the money that we sent to everybody, but is basically on an inflation-adjusted basis still neutral. We're still starting to get the numbers for 2022 here. Now, when you actually factor in the fact that these statistics, official income statistics, don't count the fact that your copays and deductibles for health insurance have tripled, so you're exposed to more out-of-pocket costs if you get into a car accident or you get sick, your actual living standards have gone down even more. So inflation-adjusted income growth net of your out-of-pocket health care costs is actually down 9% for the average Florida family over the last 15 years. And that's just income. That's before you really take into account things like, and we've talked about the cost of healthcare, but the cost of education, the cost of childcare, all the things that basically work the way a normal economy should work, where technology makes things better and cheaper and faster. Those things have gotten cheaper. Your computers have gotten cheaper. Your cell phones have gotten cheaper. I know this chart's hard to read, and I'll send it to anyone who wants it. But things that have gotten more expensive: housing, healthcare, childcare, car insurance actually has gotten much more expensive. Energy in certain ways has gotten expensive. And so the cost of living keeps going up. And what does that lead to? So if you actually, and then let's take higher education as an example. So if you look at Florida in-state tuition, this is the gray line here. The blue line is household income, which, as I said, is flat. And then here is the NASDAQ 100. Now you might think this is great, you know. So if you got your money in the NASDAQ 100, you've done well. We can participate in the innovation economy and thereby overcome the rising cost of living that ordinary Americans face. There's only one problem with that, which is that the percentage of Americans who participate in the stock market is actually relatively low. It turns out, does anyone want to guess? The wealthiest, I have this slide here, it says the wealthiest 10% of Americans own what percent of all U.S. stocks owned by households, meaning not by corporations? Someone said 90%. That was pretty good. 89%, right? So 89% of all the gains in the stock market that you saw in that last chart are accruing to the top 10% of the country. Not the top 1%, as some might say, the top 10%. Now, again, if you're in the top 10%, as we all are in this room, then that's great. But if you're not, you feel left behind. You're not participating in that stock market increase. And by the way, think about all the great tech companies, all the great innovation. Who gets to invest in those companies when they're private companies? Accredited investors. Who's allowed to be an accredited investor by the federal government? Someone who has an annual income of over $250,000 or has a net worth of $1 million. So the federal government actually makes it illegal for ordinary people to invest in the most innovative startups in America. So that's the government creating a barrier to ordinary people participating in the most innovative, dynamic parts of our economy. So let's go through some of these barriers. I mentioned that increasingly young people have lost faith in our economic system. We've talked about the fact that the cost of living has gone up and continues to go up, particularly if you're trying to own a home today, right? It used to be if you made $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year, if you were a worker at an auto plant in Detroit, you could work that job and own a home someday in Detroit after about 10 years of working. You didn't have to, you know, put down a $150,000 down payment to get a home. There's the unaffordable health care, which keeps going up every year, 6-8%. Wages are not going up 6 to 8%. Right? So every year, health care becomes less and less affordable for ordinary people. There's a lot of technological disruption of blue-collar jobs, and there's a lot of demand. There's a lot of need for jobs. We talked about this a little bit last night. There are a lot of people who can't hire enough. There aren't enough people available to work. But there's also a lot of disruption. And so you have in communities that are blue-collar oriented, let's say you live in a small town where the only employer in that town, or like, you know, let's call it the large employer that employed half the town, was a manufacturing plant. And that plant moved somewhere else, whether it's to another part of the country or whether it's to another country. Even if those workers, in theory, can try to get other jobs at some point, that's a massive disruption to that entire community. So disruption is a challenge for a lot of people in a highly dynamic economy. There's economic segregation, the fact that, we increasingly, it used to be wealthier and poorer people live together in the same communities, in the same neighborhoods. That's not really true anymore. There's the fact that our schools are failing. Schools have been failing for a long time, but it just seems to get worse. We have not hit bottom in terms of the disparities in our educational system. And then there's the issue of crime, right, which goes in every direction. We aren't very good at preventing, we've lost some of the lessons of crime reduction from the 90s and 2000s, and at the same time, we still have, if you talk to people in high crime communities, what they'll tell you is the police are terrible at preventing the criminals, but they end up harassing a lot of innocent people who didn't commit the crimes. And so on both sides, both in terms of innocent people being presumed guilty on the one hand, and the actual guilty parties going untouched, communities that are affected by crime are getting hit on both ends. And all of this ends up getting blocked or obstructed by, in every case, special interests who benefit from the status quo quite a bit, as we'll talk about. So with the approach that we have to address these issues, we've been fortunate to get a lot of coverage for it because it is different, and we found that a lot of our work is relevant to these big problems that Americans face. But I want to highlight one quote right up from the Washington Post when we founded FREOP in 2016, basically making this point that there are lots of organizations that are devoted to economic inequality, and there are lots of organizations devoted to economic freedom, but none that explicitly strive to blend the two with everything they do. And that's what we do. So if you think about, if you're familiar with other think tanks like the Brookings Institution or the American Enterprise Institute, what I've done here is I've kind of created like an X and Y axis. If you think about the left versus the right on economics, where maybe the social democratic economics is more about what we can do to subsidize things that are unaffordable, or how the government can regulate certain industries to make life more fair. And on the right side of this chart is more the free market side of the world. And then up to down is, do you have a focus on lower income Americans, or is that not a priority for you? And so if you think about Brookings, for example, Brookings is a place that has some focus on lower income Americans and is a left of center think tank economically. There's a Center for American Progress, which is more social democratic economics, more focus on lower income Americans, and then the typical kind of set of conservative think tanks and free market think tanks down here, where they're very free market oriented. Some have more of a social mobility angle than others. And FREOP is sort of the top right of this axis, of this chart, right, where we are exclusively focused on how to address the problems of lower and middle income Americans. They are the majority of the country, right? The bottom half of the country economically is more like 2/3 of the country in terms of the population. And so our theory is, if you focus on the bottom 2/3 of the country economically, that's how you create a majority for good reforms, by making sure that they're better off. And that's how you can, and if you can deploy free enterprise for that, you can create a bipartisan majority. That's something Republicans can get behind and something Democrats can get behind for different reasons. So what do we work on? We've talked about healthcare. That was our original issue because that's the background that I came from. We do a lot of work on fiscal policy because, as you know, the biggest driver of our deficit and debt is our spending on healthcare. And that also affects housing, because housing policy, there's two big elements to housing policy. There's three really, but two big ones. The first is the Federal Reserve, which when it keeps interest rates low, actually drives up the cost of housing, because people like us can borrow as much as we want at 0%, and we can buy bigger houses, and private equity firms can do the same. And so KKR buys up all the new developments, and no ordinary person can buy homes. So they basically rent from KKR. And that's great if you're KKR, not so great if you're a millennial trying to get your first home. You can't do it. So that's one big problem with why housing has become increasingly unaffordable. A second is that at the local level, in places like San Francisco, they don't allow new housing to be built. They basically have, they have zoning laws that basically say you can't build high-rise apartments here, or you can't build a second home on your property, or they have permitting restrictions that basically gum up the works if you try to build new housing, and so you can't build enough supply of housing. So the population grows, more people want to live there, but Austin is dealing with this too, where I live. So the housing gets more and more unaffordable because you don't build enough of it. And then the solution is, oh, well, housing's unaffordable. Let's subsidize it more. But if you subsidize it more, but you don't build more housing, you don't solve the problem. It's like if there was only 10 places to live and 20 people want to live in the town, subsidizing the cost of housing doesn't help because there's only 10 houses, right? And so the problem is that if you subsidize things, you actually inflate things even more. The price goes up because more and more money is chasing the same limited supply of goods. So again, people think of affordable housing as kind of a left-wing or progressive cause, but many of the solutions for making housing affordable are to look at the zoning regulations and the permitting regulations and the Federal Reserve policies, which have made housing less affordable. Government policies, when reformed, can make housing more affordable. Then there's education reform. We talked a little bit about higher ed. Biden's been in the news a lot for his student loan bailouts because, again, same thing. There are a lot of kids who graduate from college, can't afford their student loans, and Biden has wanted to forgive those loans. The problem with that is that's great for Columbia. That's great for Harvard. They can just keep increasing their tuition by 15% a year, knowing that the taxpayer is on the hook for whichever graduates of their schools goes broke later. But that just doubles down on the perverse incentives of the system we have now. If you want to make higher education more affordable, you actually have to make it less expensive. Well, how do you make it less expensive? One way is to reform the whole way that we do student loans so that we reward the colleges and universities where the graduates actually make more than what they paid to go to that school, where the ROI, the return on investment for that degree, is positive. If the ROI is negative, if they're going to Columbia for a master's in film and the degree costs them $150,000 and after they graduate they're working at Walmart for $15 an hour, then taxpayers shouldn't be subsidizing that student loan. We should tell Columbia either decrease the tuition so that the graduates can still afford to pay back their loans, or invest in those kids making more money after they graduate, or both. But you can completely change those incentives if you have the data to show what the graduates are earning after they graduate and what the schools are charging. And so, to give an example, our higher ed scholar, Preston Cooper, he built a database, a searchable database that you can go on our website and you can literally look up any degree at any university in the country. If you want to be a psychology major at Iowa State, it'll tell you, here's how much that degree costs, here's how much the average 25, 35, 45-year-old will make after you graduate. If you want to get a nursing degree at Berkeley, same thing, or Florida Atlantic, pick your school. Any school, any degree, you can look it up and you can see what the ROI of that degree is. And that's not just great for parents and their kids who are trying to figure out where to go to college and where they can have a good return on what they're paying for college, but it's really good for the government to figure out we're not going to just abolish student loans, right? We want people to have that mobility that comes from subsidizing student loans when it's appropriate. We want people to have that leg up. We want people to have equal opportunity. But if we do it in a way that incentivizes the colleges to just keep increasing their prices, then we, over the long term, decrease opportunity. We don't increase it. So by flipping that around and saying, let's just reward the colleges that consistently show that their graduates make more money and they charge less for that degree, then you can actually completely change the incentives of the way higher education works today. And in pre-K and K through 12, the big opportunity there is we have this system that's really a legacy of segregation, where we say where you go to school is a product of where you live, right? And again, in the segregated South, that made perfect sense because people didn't want the undesirables from segregated neighborhoods to be able to go to their schools. And we still have that system today. Why? Right? Why do I have a system where people are stuck going to school based on where they live instead of being able to choose among a wider variety of schools and a wider variety of educational options? So our K through 12 scholar guy named Dan Lips, a few years after he graduated from Princeton, came up with this idea of education savings accounts where the value of your tuition, your public school tuition, the parents can get that, and then you can educate them any way you want. You can hire tutoring for them. You can send them to private school. You can do it all online with Khan Academy. Whatever you want, you can take those resources and use them any way you want to educate your kids with certain parameters. And if you do that, you can completely not only give those parents and those kids more educational opportunities than they have today, but you can also create a lot of education innovation, because it's not just about the four walls of the school. You can say, okay, if there's maybe the kid wants to go to his local school, but needs remedial help in math. Or maybe he's a math genius and his school doesn't have the resources to cultivate his math geniusness. So let's give him extra tutoring for that. So there are lots of things like that that you can do if you just disaggregate how we think about public education today. Energy policy. So, so much of the energy debate and the climate debate we have in this country is based on the assumption that the way to save the planet is to make energy more expensive. Because if we make energy more expensive, people won't be able to afford it as much, and they'll consume less of it, and that will save the planet. Well, first of all, that disproportionately affects poor people, right? If you're wealthy, if you're a millionaire, if your gas prices go up or your home utilities go up, that's not as big of a deal. But if you live 2 hours from the place you work because you can't afford to live in Santa Barbara or Palm Beach, and so you have to use gas to get to your work, then you're disproportionately affected by higher energy prices. And the thing is that we have low carbon energy sources like nuclear energy that we're actually closing down. New York just closed the Indian Point nuclear facility, and so they're actually burning more coal in New York to power their electricity grid, because the green activists who don't like nuclear energy thought it was more important to get rid of this completely zero carbon source of energy that they decided they didn't like. So we're actually doing all sorts of crazy things when it comes to energy policy. If we want to reduce carbon emissions, there are ways to do that that actually make energy less expensive and more affordable and more reliable and more abundant. And we're not doing those things for ideological reasons that aren't about either reducing carbon or helping lower income people afford their energy. Immigration and trade are two issues that are, obviously have been controversial in the Trump years in terms of both, the border of the South, but also skilled immigration is an important area where we've got to actually continue to bring in the high-skilled immigrants who start companies and provide jobs to Americans. Trade, we're increasingly skeptical of trade as a source of prosperity for America, but the thing people forget is that, yes, we import a lot of things from around the world. We also export a lot of things. America exports $3 trillion worth of goods and services every year. $3 trillion. We're the second largest exporter in the world, just second to China. So if you want blue-collar Americans to succeed, but you don't give if you don't allow them to have a global market for the things they make, how are you helping blue-collar Americans? If we want blue-collar Americans to make things and have those companies be successful and those jobs be successful, we need a global market for the things that Americans build. And if you shut down global trade, it's going to hurt those very workers the most. And it's also going to increase their cost of living, because you're going to increase the costs of the goods and services they need to buy. Then there's, we talked about crime already. Social mobility is an important one. So we had a big welfare reform debate in the 90s under Bill Clinton that led to some pretty successful legislation that was bipartisan in nature. And over the last 25 years, we've kind of moved away from that model, where we said back in the 90s, we said what's really important about welfare is that it's a cushion, it's a safety net for people who undergo misfortune, that we all agree. Like if someone's going through, they lost their job or they've had a disability or something serious has happened in their lives, we want to protect those individuals. We want them to have a helping hand. But if they're able-bodied, if it's just a temporary thing, they shouldn't be on welfare for the rest of their lives if they're capable of working, especially at a time when the unemployment rate is below 3%, and most companies say they can't hire enough workers because the workers aren't available. But that's what we've done. One of our welfare scholars has done a study that shows that in 33 states, and people learned this during COVID when they lost their jobs and were on these programs for the first time, that they can get paid more if they work 0 hours a week than if they actually work a minimum wage job, 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year after taxes. And so we've created the conditions by which people don't see any hope for them. So like, why should I work so hard when things get more expensive every year and my wages aren't going to keep up, and I can make just as much money if I don't work at all? So we've demoralized tens of millions of Americans with this economic system. And then there are a couple other areas I want to highlight that we aren't in yet but are eager to get into, and we have job openings for. One is rural affairs, so addressing the specific challenges of rural communities that aren't so much about cost of living on a relative basis, because the cost of living in rural areas is lower, but the economic opportunities in rural communities in particular, and how to address the particular challenges of that. And then political competition, which is a big problem that affects all of these other problems, which is when you have a political system in which 10% of the electorate is deciding who runs in a general election, and we have someone running for Congress now, so he can tell us more about this later. But when you have 10% of the electorate deciding who runs in a general election, and the remaining 80% are not, you have a system in which you incentivize the worst kind of behavior by politicians, which is if I'm only catering to 5% of the electorate on my side and not the remaining 95%, you lose the ability to do the kinds of things that affect the majority of your constituents, because you're more worried in a gerrymandered system of being primaried than you were about getting reelected. You know you're going to get reelected if you can make it through the primary. You only have to not get a primary challenge. And the way you avoid a primary challenge is by catering to 5% of the electorate. So that's a system that doesn't have to be the system, right? We don't have to live by that system. And there are a lot of smart people who are thinking about and experimenting with ways to solve for that, so that we can actually have a system where we incentivize politicians to cater to a majority of the electorate and not merely a tiny minority. Here are some of the people on our team. I won't just dwell on this slide, just other than to say we have attracted a really amazing group of people to this organization, because so many of the people who work at think tanks, they're frustrated with the system too, just like you are. They're frustrated by the fact that you know, so many of the more partisan or more ideological organizations, they don't feel like they're getting anywhere with that. They're spinning their wheels in those kinds of settings. And they're really inspired by the fact that we're able to do work that can get bipartisan traction. And so what's our model? Like, okay, we've talked about the mission and how the mission is important and the general philosophy. But in terms of brass tacks, how do we take this mission and turn it into real change? So we start with attracting good people, and then it's about generating the ideas. Okay, so like we talked about higher ed. So college costs, you know, higher education costs keep going up. This is a problem. Why is it happening? Right? And it turns out the reason it's happening is because we've given universities a powerful incentive to keep raising prices, knowing that taxpayers are on the hook for anyone who defaults on their loans. And students are financially illiterate and don't realize that they're borrowing their lives away and getting into a lifetime of debt. So colleges have taken advantage of that. How do we fix that? So then we come up with concrete proposals that can be turned into actual legislation. We actually have a lawyer on retainer who basically takes our ideas and turns them into bills. So that saves a lot of work for the members of Congress, because trying to get a member of Congress to invest the time, and it's a whole bureaucracy. It's like trying to design plans for a house, right? Like hiring an architect. Imagine that instead of hiring an architect to build your house, in Congress, there's like 3 architects. So if you want to build a house, you have to compete with the other 500 members of Congress to basically call the legislative council in Congress and have them work on your bill as opposed to somebody else's. So we save them that effort by designing the legislation ourselves. They're still free to tweak it however they want, but we create that basic rough draft that they can then use to build on. And then, and this is where a lot of the work comes in, is doing the public and private advocacy to get more people aware of the ideas, to write the op-eds in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and appear on TV and testify before Congress and get more people interested in the ideas so that they can ultimately become laws and bills that actually make a difference for people. So to give you one example, I started by talking about my journey through healthcare. So we designed a plan to achieve universal healthcare where every American can have an affordable health insurance plan that covers the things you'd want it to cover. We turned that into legislation, which has been introduced in the House and the Senate. It achieves universal coverage without mandates, and it also reduces the deficit. So it actually, over a 30-year period, would reduce the deficit by $30 trillion with a T. which sounds like an astounding amount, but if you think about just the way healthcare grows, it's about, over the first 10 years, it's like 1 trillion. Over the next 10 years, it's like 10 trillion. It compounds. In the next 10 years, it's 19 trillion. So the powerful effect of this is not a problem you can fix in a day. But as those of you in financial markets know, once you've gotten it to a point where you know that the long-term outcomes are going to be more sustainable, that creates massive confidence in our ability to continue to borrow what we need to borrow and have financial markets and bond markets work the right way. So a 30-year time horizon is not crazy when you think about trying to fix some of these big problems. And again, it does so in a way that Democrats can support because it achieves universal coverage and a more affordable healthcare system, and things that Republicans support who care about fiscal policy and about the federal debt. Now, has that bill become law yet? No, right? So we still have work to do. But there are a lot of spin-off effects of having that thought leadership in healthcare reform. For example, when the pandemic happened, people turned to us and said, okay, how do we deal with the pandemic? What should we do? Should we keep schools closed? Should we keep the businesses closed? And we wrote a lot of articles at the time explaining that you didn't have to have a total lockdown. Yes, there are certain sorts of things you have to be careful about for public safety, but it turns out that you could reopen schools safely, particularly for younger children. You could keep certain types of businesses open. This is well before we had vaccines. This is the spring of 2020. We way overreacted in terms of shutting down society, shutting down the economy. There were things we could have done a little bit more carefully. And we wrote a big white paper about this that was, Republicans and Democrats, thought leaders participated in. We published it online on our website. I then got a call from the Wall Street Journal. They said, we love this paper. Can you write a 2,400-word summary of it for our weekend review section? So we did that. They put it on the cover of their Saturday essay, for those of you who read the Journal. And then we had governors and superintendents and task force leaders in the various states call us and say, okay, we love this. This is very interesting. The thing we're trying to figure out right now is how to get the schools open in September. Because all this other stuff is great, but that's the thing where we need to plan ahead. If we want schools to open in September, we have to be making certain decisions in May, June, July to get the schools open. So we dropped everything, worked on that, how to get schools reopened safely. And we didn't win everywhere because, particularly for those of you who live in states where you experience this, you know that not every state reopened their schools for that school year. But a lot of states did, so many so that because of our work, and not just because of our work, obviously the governors and these school officials had to also put their necks on the line. But almost 50 million kids had in-person education in the 2020 to 21 school year, in significant part because of the scientific work that we did to show that school reopenings could be done safely. And that's massive for social mobility. You think about the kids who didn't have that opportunity, who basically had Zoom calls during 3rd grade. And then all of a sudden, schools finally do reopen the following year. They're in 4th grade, but they didn't learn 3rd grade math. They didn't learn 3rd grade reading. So now they're in 4th grade, and they're flunking 4th grade math because they never learned 3rd grade math. And they literally are going to spend the rest of their lives flunking because they got advanced a grade without learning the stuff that they didn't learn because their school was closed in 2020. So that's an example of a major contribution on a major issue that for us was a relatively small piece of what we do because we happen to have the expertise and the credibility that people who are both Democrats and Republicans felt they could turn to and know that it wasn't going to be partisan to do that. I mentioned our universal education savings accounts work, which has now been enacted into law in about a dozen states, including Florida. And so as a result of that work, there are several million school children who are now eligible for these accounts and able to have resources for their education that they would not have had otherwise, particularly, again, lower income parents and communities. Our work on veterans health care has done a lot to improve veterans health care choice. And our work on prescription drug reform in the Medicare plan, so some of you are maybe familiar with those pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act. We were very involved in designing that legislation. In order to, because there was a lot of concern from the pharmaceutical and biotech industry that if Medicare negotiates drug prices, that's going to kill all the innovation in the pharmaceutical industry. And that's I come from that world, so I know, I happen to know a little bit about what the incentives are for innovation and how to make sure we protect those incentives. And so we did a lot under the hood to make sure that those, that the Medicare negotiation was targeted at the right problems, the places where prices were going up for no good reason that had nothing to do with innovation, and that the truly innovative parts of the sector were protected. And as a result of that, not only are we going to have a more fiscally sustainable Medicare prescription drug system, but you're going to lower health insurance premiums for Part D for 64 million seniors, for every single Medicare enrollee. And by the way, those of us who may be in Medicare someday and who pay the taxes to fund the system. In fact, all of us benefit from a more sustainable Medicare system. I'm not even counting that. I'm only counting the enrollees here who are actually in the program today. So this number, in a sense, is almost an undercount of the number of people we've influenced, which, again, it seems crazy. Like, how can a little think tank with 30 people and a $2.5 million budget have an impact on 120 million people? And the reason is nobody else is doing this work. And it turns out that if you make small improvements in gigantic multi-trillion-dollar problems, small improvements add up to actually big numbers. And it reminds me of when Martin Luther King gave that famous "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963. The world we live in now could not have been foreseen, right? Where we take for granted the principle that we should treat everyone equally and judge people by the content of their character, right? We've gone, we have a lot of debate now about having gone overboard in the other direction on these topics. But the point I'm trying to make is when he gave this speech, it almost seemed inconceivable that we would be in a world where we take for granted the fact that everyone, regardless of race, has an opportunity for success in America. And so a lot of these problems that today seem impossible, there's so many examples in the course of our history, whether it's in the private sector, whether it's in politics, where things seemed impossible, but actually turned out to be possible in retrospect. And I hope I've convinced you that the problems we're trying to solve are really hard. There's no doubt about that. Trying to get the dogs and cats to sleep together is really hard. But there are real-world examples of things that have happened, laws that have passed, rules that have changed, where we've carefully built those relationships between progressives and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, to achieve problems that we all want to solve. And I'm actually, it's been really rewarding work for everyone on our team. And someone was asking me last night, Erwin was asking me last night, it's like, don't you get frustrated because the odds of success are so low with this stuff? And I'm like, look, if I didn't work on it, the odds would be 0 of success, right? And maybe the odds of success are 15% that we solve the federal debt problem now versus 0. But every percent matters because it's our kids that are going to be inheriting this very challenging environment with 100 trillion or 200 trillion of debt. We can't even imagine what will happen then, right? So we have to solve these problems. And the good news is that there are ways to do it. So let me stop there. I've been going on for a bit, and let me take some questions. Thank you. Go ahead. Yeah, sure. So the question was, could I comment on immigration? Our approach to immigration immigration is really interesting because there's a lot of heat about the immigration issue. People argue about it a lot, right? But if you actually take the emotion out of it and you say, okay, what is it that we want? What do 80% of Americans want the immigration system to look like? What they want is they want a system in which people like all of us, there should be a good and healthy and real functional legal process where we can bring in the people who will make our country stronger and better. And we want to make sure that we have a border that's secure, where we actually are designing and deciding who gets into the country. And right now, we're not doing either of those things well, right? So we have a border situation where people are just crossing over the border, and once they get into the system, the asylum process is broken, so they never leave, on the one hand. And on the other hand, our legal system, there are a lot of really talented people with PhDs or who want to start companies or who have investable assets who are not allowed into the country because our legal immigration system is such a mess. And so we need to, in a sense, fix both, and we can't fix the legal system because so many people are mistrustful of Congress and of Washington because of the way the illegal system or lack of a system is working. So how do you solve that? The interesting thing is whether you would talk to someone who's thought of today as a moderate, like a Jeb Bush, or someone on the center left, similar like a Bill Clinton, or you talk to someone like a Donald Trump who has a reputation for being very anti-immigration, they actually have proposed the same plan. So Jeb Bush's plan to reform immigration and Donald Trump's plan that he proposed in 2019 with Jared Kushner when he was in the White House are not that different. They basically say, let's secure the border, let's make sure there aren't people abusing the system, but let's also make sure that we reform the legal immigration system so that it's oriented towards people who can contribute economically to the United States. That's not how it works today. The legal immigration system in America today is set up so that basically 70% of the legal immigrants are related family relations of existing immigrants or U.S. citizens. Only 30% of the legally admitted immigrants are economically oriented in terms of they have a PhD or they have a job skill, like they're a doctor, we need more doctors, something like that. The impression that Americans have is that all the people who are coming to this country legally are the economic immigration, the people who can contribute something. That's not true, actually. Those people are waiting in line. If you have a PhD in computer science, and we have a massive shortage of PhDs in computer science in the United States, you can't get in. There's a 10-year backlog. But if you are the mother of a U.S. citizen or legal immigrant who lives somewhere else, you can come into the country. Now, that's great. We want the moms of our citizens and immigrants to be able to come here in theory, but if that's taken a slot away from somebody who really can contribute to the workforce, then we haven't done right by Americans in terms of the illegal immigration system. So our approach to immigration reform is really to focus on the securing the border stuff is really straightforward in terms of we want to do it. It's not that hard. So we don't really invest a lot of intellectual energy in that. What we invest the intellectual energy in is how do you make the legal immigration system better so that when we're ready to do that deal of securing the border, tackling illegal immigration, and pairing that with legal immigration reform, we've got the right policies in place, if that makes sense. All right, go ahead. She said the talk has been quite wonderful. I wanted to make sure to repeat that.
But I'm left up in the air on how you really make a change. How do you really do it? What's the everyday process of what you're really doing? How does it really work? How do you do change cats and dogs?
Yeah. One thing that I've observed in doing this work, when we started FREOP in 2016, it was a theory, it was a hypothesis that this was a way to move beyond the polarized environment that we have in Washington. And now that we're 7.5, 8 years into it, I can tell you it's not a hypothesis. I mean, we have more conviction now that this works than we did 8 years ago, because I can't tell you the number of times I walked into a senator or a congressman's office and they've been so grateful that we reached out to them, because the people, if you watch the news, and most of us, we're reading the paper, we're watching the news, we're following stuff, right? The problem is the media is a distortion field. And I don't mean the media is biased one way or another in terms of left versus right. I mean in the sense of the media craves conflict. And so the people who are being covered, the politicians who are being covered by the media are the ones who are generating a lot of controversy, a lot of conflict. And there are a lot of members of Congress who have their heads down, who are doing good work, but precisely for that reason, what they're doing is not generating a front page in the newspaper because it's not controversial, right? By definition, if you're cooperating with other people and you're being reasonable, it's not going to make the front page of the paper, or it's not going to make the headlines in the evening news. And so what we found is that there's this kind of silent majority of hardworking people out there who are trying to solve real problems for their constituents, because that's why they got into politics. And again, so that's the good news. The good news is that there are a lot of people out there who really care about doing the right thing by their constituents and are very open to our ideas about how to solve problems like affordability of housing, affordability of healthcare, affordability and accessibility of higher education, on and on and on and on. Job and wage growth. There are a lot of people who care about this stuff, and they come to us and say, hey, I heard you have, I saw your article on this or your paper on this. I have this particular problem I'm trying to solve. Will you help us with this? Or we're having a hearing in Congress on this topic. Will one of your scholars testify? So they reach out to us a lot too. The thing that we found that's really interesting is that problem, the problem of the left versus right, is much less of a problem. The bigger problem is the special interests. Take the school reopening issue, right? I can say in this room, well, this is being recorded, so I guess I can't say everything in this room, but we worked with politicians from all stripes on reopening schools. Given that it got kind of coded as a left versus right issue, this would surprise people, but there were lots and lots of Democrats who wanted to reopen schools in their states and their cities. And we worked with them to try to get that done. The problem was the teachers' unions were adamantly against reopening schools. Why? Because the teachers were getting paid regardless of whether schools were open or not, so they didn't care. So they looked at it like, any incremental risk for me in terms of COVID is a negative. Economically, there's no risk if the schools stay closed because I'm getting paid either way. And if you're a Democratic politician, you can't afford to cross the teachers' unions, because if they support your primary opponent, that's the end of the line for you. Or if you have ambitions for a higher office and you don't have the teachers' unions behind you, that's the end of the line for you. So even those Democratic politicians who understood how harmful it would be to low-income communities in their constituencies to keep schools closed, they couldn't do it. And so, and that's, healthcare is a great example. You know, everyone agrees that healthcare is too expensive. But if you talk to the CEO of your favorite hospital, they'll say, well, it's not our fault that healthcare is expensive. Blame the surgeons, or blame the pharmaceutical companies, or blame the insurers. It's not our fault that healthcare is expensive. We're doing everything right. Right? You talk to the pharmaceutical companies and say, oh, it's not our fault that healthcare is so expensive. Blame the hospitals, you know? So they all have their boogeymen, and they all blame each other, but they are themselves often the ones who are fighting this stuff. So one of the things that we are building and thinking hard about is, how do you create an infrastructure to tackle these very, very, I mean, we're a tiny organization compared to, say, you know, the healthcare industry, which is a multi-trillion-dollar industry. How do you actually overcome their opposition to stuff? Well, and there are two ways. But the most important way is you get the people on your side, right? Healthcare is so expensive. Everyone knows healthcare is so expensive. People care about it so much that even though politicians are afraid to cross the healthcare industry, they also want to help their constituents. So you can create a real kind of balance of power there, or actually even a superiority of the power of ordinary people in those situations where their economic interests are so important and so compelling that you can overcome those entrenched interests. And you don't win all those battles, but you can win enough of them that you can make progress. So again, it's like dieting, right? There's no magic formula for dieting. You just have to do it. You have to exercise, you have to eat better, maybe avoid the key lime pie if you're me. But similarly here, you're not going to win on every issue, but you can, but using these tools and making clear to the members that, hey, your constituents will reward you. Yes, maybe the hospital association will run ads against you, but your constituents will be so grateful that you did this that it'll be in your interest, it'll be in your political interest to adopt these policies. Yes, in the back.
You showed us a graph pointing to income for many workers in America. Many workers in America have not changed over the past 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
Numerous factors have been pointed to of reasons for that, but one of them is that management, senior management, owners are taking a bigger and bigger share of the revenues, the profits. Most of the American economy is non-unionized. How do you address that? Because otherwise, a number of the reforms, if those groups are taking more and more of the profits, they're just going to take even more of increased productivity.
So this is a big topic. I would say a couple things. One, there are certain elements of the amount of economic returns that that investors and executives are garnering that is not about exploitation, but about globalization. So if you create a product that ends up, particularly this is true in software, right? But it's true in a globalized economy in general. If you create a product, if you're Mark Zuckerberg and you create Facebook, and there's billions of people who use Facebook, or Microsoft Office, for example, these are global products that are created by a relatively small workforce. There are going to be disproportionate earnings that get reinvested in certain ways. So part of that is American companies have become very successful, and some of those earnings, what really matters is a little bit less the share that goes to CEOs versus workers, and what matters more is the absolute amount of money that the workers get, right? So if the percentage that a Steve Jobs or a Elon Musk gets is, if Elon Musk is the richest guy in the world, but everyone who works at Tesla is making good money, then those workers are not really upset about the fact that Elon Musk is rich. People say, you know what? He built an electric car company. Lots of people have tried and failed to do that. He succeeded. And I've got a good job that's got great benefits, that's growing. You know, that part is okay. The real problem is less the kind of share of compensation between CEOs and workers, though there are problems with that. And I don't want to gloss over it completely. There are definitely places where CEOs are getting paid in a way that doesn't really make sense relative to what workers are getting paid. But the bigger issue is that the equity in those companies is being paid to CEOs. And why is that? So when we talk about CEO compensation, remember there was this big movement in the 80s and 90s where we said it's really terrible that the salaries of CEOs aren't tied to the performance of the companies. And so we said we would fix that. How are we going to fix it? By giving them stock options. Because the idea was the stock price of the company would go up and down based on the company's performance. And therefore, by tying the CEO's compensation to the company's performance, that would be more meritocratic and more fair than just giving them a 7-figure or 8-figure salary for just kind of like showing up at work. Right? So we thought that we were fixing the problem, making it more fair by tying CEO compensation to stock performance. But what was the unintended consequence of that? The unintended consequence of that was that CEOs then started worrying about their share price all the time, and sometimes doing things that were a little maybe accounting oriented to keep their PE ratio a certain, or the EPS at a certain level, because that's how they were getting paid. And that led to a lot of financialization of companies saying, let's eliminate this plant over here and move it to this other low-cost jurisdiction because that will increase our EPS, right? So there were unintended consequences of a lot of things we did in the 90s that were about actually trying to make CEO compensation more fair and more meritocratic that ended up hurting workers. So what we want to do is actually have a corporate structure in which companies don't have those perverse incentives, number one. Number two, we need to have an equity market or financial market in which ordinary workers can participate. This was the great revolution of ETFs. The one good thing that we did that was kind of pro-worker in the last 25, 30 years is we created this suite of products that ordinary people could invest in their 401ks. We created 401ks, number one, in the 80s, and then we created easy index funds that allowed people to participate in the broader stock market. But as I mentioned earlier, for the most innovative parts of the economy, ordinary people don't have access to those innovations until they're much more mature. They're post-IPO. So we've still kept a lot of people out of the innovative part of the economy. And even the part of the economy that's accessible, the stock market, it's the top 10% of the country from a wealth standpoint that participates. So we've got to make it a lot easier for workers to participate in the upside of the broader financial markets and the stock market and the economy, number one. But we also have to keep in mind that we can't do that if their cost of living keeps going up. Right? So that's the real problem. The real problem is not merely that wage growth has been stagnant. The real problem has been that wage growth has been stagnant and the cost of living has increased massively because the Federal Reserve has convinced itself that a certain amount of inflation is good. And has been oblivious to how low interest rate policies have created a higher cost of living for ordinary workers. So we've made the life of ordinary workers much less stable, not so much by what percentage of their income is, of a company is going to them versus the CEOs, but by making ordinary life so expensive that they can't afford to save anything and therefore have a 401k or a stock portfolio or savings the way we took for granted you could do 50 years ago. So anyway, that's even a too long of an answer than I meant to give, and I could go on for probably several hours on this topic, so find me later if you have more questions on that. Do you have a question up here? Go ahead.
I was a little taken aback by your focus on return on investment for college education. Well, as basically a free market guy, I get that. As an art history major, I don't get that.
Right.
And I don't, how do you reconcile those two issues? Because we can't have everybody going to business school.
Sure. Great question, and a question that we get all the time from not just our historians, but from college presidents who think that, it's funny, college presidents will say things like, the education you get at our university is priceless, with their kind of eyes looking at the ceiling very, very dreamily. And then if you say, but you do put a price on the education that you charge students, don't you? Because they all do, right? So they think it has a price. And so the question isn't, should people not major in art history? I would love it if more people majored in art history and majored in classics and majored in all these impecunious courses of study. I think that's very valuable. I myself am a big believer in all that stuff. The question is, why should the college you went to charge $300,000 for a 4-year degree in art history? Why don't they charge less for that degree and maybe charge more to the student who's majoring in economics or computer science? There's nothing that prevents for universities from having different pricing models for different types of programs, just like we do for medical school and law school and business school. They choose not to because they don't have to. There's no incentive to. It's easier to just charge everyone for that. But if they want more people to major in art history, it's very much in their incentive to charge less for that degree. Why do people not major in art history? Usually it's because either they or their parents are saying, don't major in art history. There's no money in that. You're not going to be able to pay off your student loans if you major in art history, right? How many of those conversations happen? So if we want more people to major in art history, the schools could today, without me doing anything, voluntarily decide to say, you know what, if you major in art history, we will give you a scholarship or a financial aid package in terms of grants, not loans, grants in terms of just lowering your tuition, that is correspondent to the predicted income of a graduate with that degree. But the universities don't do that.
Excuse me, but the art market has risen faster than the stock market.
That has to do with the Federal Reserve, actually. But yes, if you're an art historian, you don't become, the founder of the next Gagosian gallery necessarily, as most art history majors will tell you. I mean, yes, there are people who manage to get into the art business and do very well with that. But for those of you who who interact with that business, it's a pretty tough business to break into, particularly at that level. That's true. Yeah. Well. Yeah. 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 I mean, look. I mean, the art market is an asset market. It's like venture capital. It's a market that goes up and down based on where assets are flowing. Right. I mean, Steve Cohen, one of the great hedge fund minds, that was one of his insights. Right. Is that he was diversifying out of equities by buying a lot of Damien Hirst and did really well with that, as did his gallerists. Anyone else? Yes, in the back there.
Any thoughts of running for office of any type? You're kind of an idea guy, and we need more idea guys in there.
Well, thank you. I think that's meant as a compliment, but maybe it's not. I appreciate the question. I think I think personally, what I do is I'm doing what I do now. I'm able to help more people in a sense because I can talk to a much broader range of politicians doing what I do now in theory. Now, it is true that one thing I've found as we've acquired champions in Congress or in state capitals, where there might be a certain member of Congress who really loves our higher ed reform plan or our healthcare plan and really champions it. They turn out to be pretty effective because, you know, they have every other congressman's cell phone number, right? So like they see them every day in the chamber. So they're actually the most effective advocates for our work because, you know, it takes me 100 meetings to have the same impact that they have in one day walking around on the floor of the House. So, so there is an effectiveness that comes from having public office that you know you don't have when you're on the outside in theory. But I think the real big challenge is that for someone with this message, these ideas, in your typical congressional district, they don't, you know, in a primary, it doesn't really work, right? You know, you really need to be either in a district where for whatever peculiar reason you can run with that kind of agenda, or we have a very different system for the way we select the candidates. You know, I mentioned the political competition issue, which is a very interesting issue that a lot of, as I said, a lot of really smart people are working on, and we hope to get more involved in as well, where instead of having a Republican and Democratic primary, say, you just have a nonpartisan primary where everyone runs in the same primary, whatever party you're affiliated with, and the top 2 or 3 or 4 candidates then make the general election, and then they run in the general, and that way, you know, you have a real choice as a voter, and you also have real incentives as a candidate to appeal to the center of the electorate, because the center of the electorate is not disenfranchised by the way the kind of the primaries and the general are set up. So, you know, there are ways to reform the way we select candidates for office that make this kind of politics more attractive. And I think if and when that happens in a place where I happen to live, then maybe that's an interesting thing. And also it could be like, look, I mean, I live in a district right now that is represented by actually a guy with my last name, Chip Roy, who is a member of the House Freedom Caucus, who's, you know, which is thought of as a very kind of right-wing guy, right-wing congressman. But the district itself is I'd say pretty middle of the road to maybe a little right of center, but not by much. It's Austin, you know. So and so the district itself is pretty amenable to a lot of the stuff, I think. It's just that, again, the primary system is such that you need to run the way Chip Roy runs in order to win the primary in the district. So that's a long-winded way of saying that I think, you know, it's not set up the right way, I feel like, right now for someone with my temperament and point of view to do that sort of work. But maybe at some future point that's different. And again, we have someone who's running for Congress right now who might have smarter things to say about all that.
Well,
go ahead. Oh, are we done?
Yeah. Do you want one? Okay, one more question, and then you can talk when
okay.
you know we finish this.
Thank you so much for this inspiring conversation. This is real democracy.
Thank you.
This is what our country is really about. And I have a favorite phrase that says, when the tide rises, all ships rise. And I feel like that's what you've created here. So 2 quick questions. Do you have an intern program so that the graduate from Harvard or all these young people who are frustrated could study with each of you experts and help? And 2, what would you give as a suggestion to each one of us to make a difference today in these wonderful ideas that are a true democracy? Well, that's those are great questions. So and thank you. On the internship front, we do take interns every summer. In fact, we get way more applications than we don't even have a formal internship program. There's nothing on our website that says internship, but we get these incoming emails from people saying, "I would love to intern with you," and so we only have a certain amount of capacity to take interns, but we do try to do that. And so if you know people who are interested, or if anyone here does, and want to send them my way, my email address is I can repeat it for anyone who needs it. It's just aroy@freop.org, FREOPP.org, and you can, on our website there's a form also that you can
that you can fill out to just send us your contact information. And yes, we've had some real success with interns that have done great work for us. So that's been great. And I will say that young people, we get a lot. Part of why we started Free Op is because we were trying to address this this particular sense of hopelessness and despair from young people about the system that they were entering into. And one thing they often say when they talk to us, when they interview, is, you know, Avik, I was reading the articles on your website, and what was really amazing about it is you put into words things that I've always thought but never had the language to think myself. And it reminds me so much of the novel 1984, where, you know, people lost the ability to articulate certain things about equal opportunity because we've lost that language. And so part of what we try to do is give people that, just the language to be able to talk about these things and use those instincts that they have to apply their own brain power to try to solve these problems, because we have no monopoly on good ideas. As to your second question about what you all can do to help, you know, there's all sorts of things, but I'd say the first is just to hopefully take, if these ideas have resonated with you, take them and share them with other people. And I mean by that the overall idea that there are, number one, there is a way to move past the polarization of our current environment, and there are good people working on how to do that. And you know, you can explain to them whatever you can retain from this talk, or go to our website and do that. And if you wanna get on our mailing list and get emails from us that where we share our work with you, so you can learn more about it, happy to do that. Happy for anyone who wants to support our work or spread the word about it. Thank you. And let me just say this, since that's the last question. You know, there's a great a quote by Margaret Mead that I love and I think about all the time. It's one that's widely used, but it really is true. And it's, never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. And it really is true. You think about all the great social movements of the world. Every single one, there was a small group of people who were at the core of that movement that basically came up with the ideas that then caught fire. And the thing about the problems that we face is that they are so big and so important to ordinary people that they have to be solved. People will demand that they be solved. They'll either be solved badly or well. And a lot of our work, take the healthcare work. You build the idea, you build the legislation, you talk about it with people, and maybe people aren't ready to implement that idea today. But when the crisis comes and they are looking for something to pull off the shelf, like the fire alarm, you know, the break glass in case of emergency, if you can pull off the shelf something that's well thought through, that they're familiar with, that they've been thinking about for several years, that they know smart people who've thought about these issues are behind, they have more confidence that in that crisis they can pull that thing down and pass it and get some reforms done. A lot of our work is around that. The education savings account stuff, Dan Lips has been talking about that for 18 years. It was just because there was all this money sloshing around schools during COVID that people had the resources to finally implement it, and so they did. And so there was this wave of education savings accounts reforms over the last 12 to 18 months that were on the shelf for a long time, but there was a breakthrough because of this kind of weird side effect of the pandemic that gave people the startup money they needed to seed these funds. And that's what allowed these programs to pass and change the trajectories of entire states and poor kids in entire states, millions of kids, because of this one guy who had an idea in 2005 that he put in a paper. So that's what I would say, is that just to share that that belief that these things can change. And yes, they're hard. I don't mean to in any way paper over the fact that these are hard problems to solve. But there are a lot of hard problems we've had in American history that we have solved, and these problems are all solvable. So thank you very much.